Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Lifestyle Mastery, and today I'm excited to have Jonny Miller, who's the founder of Nervous System Mastery, a course that has helped hundreds of founders and tech leaders cultivate calm, reduce nervousness, enhance resilience, and elevate their sense of aliveness. Welcome to the show, Johnny.
It's great to be here.
Awesome. So, you have an interesting journey. You did start up with, getting into startups, and you started at Durham. How was the experience, at university in Durham? It's one of the best B schools in the UK. And, how did that lead to starting with MapTier?
Mm. So I studied philosophy and economics at Durham, which was pretty useless when it came to kind of having a career. And I remember doing an internship in London for a consulting company and just thinking, like, I do not want to do this. It just didn't feel interesting in any way to me. So my two good friends and I started a travel magazine when we were at university. It's called Rome Magazine. And as we were graduating, we heard about this program called Startup Chile, which still exists as far as I'm aware. And it's a government-run incubator which awards, at least it did award 40,000 US dollars to foreign entrepreneurs to fly to Santiago and start a business. So we applied. We knew very little about startups. My co-founder Dean thought startups were something to do with engines. Like we literally had no idea what we were doing. And we flew to Santiago, and that was like our kind of initiation into the entrepreneurial world. And from there, we quickly ran out of money, and then we applied for Techstars in Seattle. We got accepted into Techstars and got more investment, and that was the that was the kind of humble beginnings of our startup MapTier.
Okay, okay. And what was the final outcome to the startup? Were you able to successfully sell it, or how did it pan out for you?
I wish that were the case. It panned out with me burning out.
Uh,
And, yeah, it was a media-based business, and at the time, I think it still is. It was very challenging to make sustainable revenue from that. But I learned a hell of a lot, and we were connected with some amazing people. So I don't regret the experience, but it ended up with me leaving, and then eventually the company kind of wound down a couple of years later.
okay, okay. And interestingly, you talked about startup Chile. I got a couple of founders who've been on that journey where yeah had you had to go there for a year and then you get a bit of funding. Would you still give the advice to a younger Johnny to go abroad and do the startup life, or would you suggest somebody to work in a big consulting company or a big company, work there for a
Mm.
couple of years and then do a startup?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of giving advice to a younger version of myself, that's always tricky because I really like how things turned out, so I wouldn't want to change anything. But if I was giving advice to, let's say, listeners, um, I do think there is a case for spending a couple of years in a kind of bigger company in a consulting context to kind of build up the skills, network. I think that can work. And, for people like myself, I think I just would have struggled in that environment. And so for me, it was the right step to go straight into the startup world. And that was a very, very intensive, like learning environment. And I think, when you're in your 20s, really focusing on optimizing for learning, I feel like is the way to go. So whatever route feels like the fastest path to learn as much as possible and experiment and try different contexts, try different areas. Yeah, that's my sense. And it's very context dependent as well.
Got it, got it. Interesting. And what led you into starting Curious Humans and building nervous system mastery? What ignited you to start it?
Yeah, so I when I left the that startup, I kind of went through a period of being a little bit lost and kind of wondering, not really knowing what on earth to do. I ended up being invited in to mentor and then teach a startup curriculum in London, which I really enjoyed. And in that, I kind of like reconnected with my sense of just like love of learning and love of curiosity specifically. And I listened to a lot of podcasts and I was like, oh, this seems like a great way to meet interesting people, as I'm sure you can relate to have interesting conversations, to improve my skills at asking good questions, which feels essential. Um, and that also turned into a newsletter. And then a few years after that, I went through a fairly intense grief journey myself. I kind of lost my former fiance at the time. And during that journey, I learned skills, particularly for kind of feeling my emotions, which I realized would have been very helpful when I'd been a startup founder. So I ended up doing these workshops that I called emotional resilience and teaching breathing practices, meditation practices, mindset practices, and initially coaching with startup founders, and then doing workshops, and that then led to this idea of like, oh, I think there's a body of work here that's emerging. I wonder if I could create a 5-week course, and so that's what I put together in 2021. Just kind of did like a beta pilot version for about 60 people, and the feedback from that was fantastic, and so it just really kept on growing from there. And last year we had 600 students go through the program, so it grew a lot in the space of a year. And it seems to both be really resonating, and I really enjoy learning, writing, teaching, and improving as well. So yeah, it's been fun.
Interesting, because you lived in Bali and Mexico. How's Bali as a startup culture ecosystem? I know Peter Levels from the
Mhm.
Nomad list. I think he also lives there. How did you find it uh, a totally different experience from how the Western startup world works? Any insights about
Mm.
Bali culture?
Yeah, so I lived there for 3 years and then the year during COVID as well. So I spent a good amount of time there.
Nice,
I'd say it's for me, it was fantastic for having a kind of like healthy balance. Like I'd go surfing every day. I did a yoga teacher training. It's obviously a beautiful, beautiful place, beautiful culture. Um, there was a startup culture there. I'd say it was at the time, this may have changed, but it was mostly freelancers, indie hackers, people
nice,
like that, and less like venture funded startups.
right,
There's certainly a handful, but
right.
the people that I mostly connected with were more in that kind of like freelancer, bootstrapper kind of phase.
Got it, right. So Johnny, I've had a lot of sales, business development, and partnership experience. Obviously, you meeting a lot of people, but you also pitching to a lot of people, and could be high pressure moments. Especially when you're trying to sell into enterprise
Mm.
sales. So I do get nervous at times. So what advice would you give to somebody who's been to sales and high pressure situations to elevate nervousness, and how do I look at getting myself into a more calmer situation so that I can look at being calm and being more composed during those meetings.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. Just out of interest, what's it like for you when you get nervous, let's say, just before an important sales meeting? Like, what's your experience?
Yeah, so I do a bit of a breathing exercise before I get into a meeting, or
Hmm.
or go for a walk so that I have that energy, because sometimes you don't want to show off less energy when you get into those sort of meetings. But if it's a big meeting, it's on my mind that I don't want to screw it up. But there is a moment of tension, and I need to prepare a lot before these meetings. If I'm not well prepared, it sometimes gets into my psyche that maybe I'm not ready for those sort of meetings. So yeah, I mean, any advice or tips for sales guys or revenue, people who would want to get better in preparing for those meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I still get nervous sometimes before big podcast interviews as well. Like
Yeah.
the one with Lenny recently. Before that, I was like, I'm pretty nervous right now. Um, so one of the distinctions that I like to share, which I think is very helpful, is this idea between top down versus bottom up approaches.
Right.
So what that means is top down is generally mind-based or cognitive-based exercises or reframes, which help you to kind of Let's say like maybe reframe like I'm not feeling nervousness, it's excitement, like I'm feeling excitement, and that type of thing, or like I'm nervous because I care so much about this, and so it's like a positive reframe to make it a good thing, and those can certainly be helpful. Um, what I found, and this is somewhat backed up by the neurobiology as well, is that bottom-up practices, which involve using the body to change the state of your nervous system, which then impacts the thoughts and feelings that you're having. So, a typical example would be doing a breathing practice where the exhale is twice as long as the inhale. So that
Okay.
might be inhale for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 8, for example. And that will very quickly activate the parasympathetic nervous system and really help to kind of ground some of that nervous energy that you might be experiencing. So you can stack many of these different bottom-up practices. Another one that is popular with my students is vu hum, where you take a full breath in and you make the sound vu and then hum all the way to the end of exhale. And that has a number of effects like releasing nitric oxide in the system, which is also a vasodilator, which helps with the downshifting. It's also a long exhale. There's also things like you can kind of play with your awareness. So bringing your awareness to your hands and your feet, or expanding your awareness. This is a technique from the Alexander technique. So kind of being aware of the space behind you, to the sides of you, above you, below you. Often when we get nervous, our kind of field of awareness gets very narrow and contracts, and that increases the sense of like anxiousness. And so by relaxing and expanding that, there's more a sense of spaciousness and ease, which can be helpful. But I'd say most of all, it's a process of listening to your body and then experimenting and trying different things and seeing what works for you, and really developing, particularly, if you have high stakes sales calls on a regular basis, maybe you create like a little ritual or a little routine of yourself before these sessions. So maybe it's like you go for a walk, you do a little bit of stretching, you think about what's going to happen, visualize it, and then before you go in, you do 5 minutes of breathing and humming. And then when you actually get on, that energy is there, but it's very much grounded.
Right. And yeah, you made an interesting point about visualization. How how c- how should somebody look at visualizing, and how should they look at visualizing like a sales meeting? Is it more, there's a lot of talk about affirmations and visualization. Does it really work? Because my wife really believes into affirmations. I'm
Mm.
like, it's more about, executing. But what are
Mhm.
your thoughts on that? How can somebody visualize to do something correctly or achieve your goals?
Yeah, so like what I actually practice is I research a lot. Let's say if I'm going to interview someone,
Right.
I'll read their book, write some notes down, and then in the kind of hour or two before, I will deliberately like let all of that go. I actually won't think about what I'm going to say. And I found that when I do that, and the move here, I think is actually really, it comes back to like trusting myself and allowing myself to be more present and more in the moment so I can respond to what I'm noticing. So whereas if I am, say, attached to like a certain script or a certain like thing that I'm going to say, it actually creates a rigidity which both decreases connection, and it also means that I'm less likely to respond to whatever the person is saying or showing. So I do find there's this interesting dance between, maybe there's a visualization of like these are kind of the main the arc of the conversation or the arc of the sales call, and there's this like almost like a paradox where then you kind of let it go and you just trust yourself to say and do the right things. And that is to some degree a function of experience as well. In the beginning, having more structure as almost like a guardrail is helpful.
Right.
Um, but that's what I find. And certainly the conversations, if I'm receiving a sales call, I'm much more likely to engage with someone that feels like they're really listening and they're really present, and they're not like 50% of their mind isn't like tracking a script that they're going through.
Yeah. Yeah. Got it. And what do you think about, meditation or Vipassana or yoga? Do
Mm.
you think these really help? And what's the right way about, using these to reduce stress?
Great question. What's your experience with them, just before I answer?
To be honest, I haven't done Vipassana. I've heard a lot of my Indian friends doing
Mhm.
Vipassana. I think when it comes to meditation, I do use Calm, where I do before a call or early in the morning. I do it for 3 to 5 minutes. It
Mm,
does help me, but maybe I'm not very consistent about it.
mm.
And maybe I would want to look at these uh you know especially meditation, yoga, to calm myself, but I just really don't know how beneficial it's going to be, because I don't want to spend an hour just doing vipassana or yoga for that matter.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I'm just thinking of the conversation with Lenny where he has like the contrarian corner, and I have some like contrarian opinions about meditation.
Right.
Um, I I love meditation. I've spent probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours meditating myself.
Right.
But if your goal is to reduce stress and to calm down, I don't think that meditation is the best approach.
Okay.
Um, it tends to be, and there've even been some studies to show this, that meditation can even be, destabilizing. And if you kind of go back to like the original purpose for how many of these meditations were constructed, mostly in the East, in the culture that you're from, it was more oriented to destabilize the sense of self and kind of see through to the true nature of reality. Like that is essentially what these meditations are designed to do. So if that is your goal, if your goal is to kind of see through the illusion of the self, great. Like that is like you should do that. You should go train in Zen, whichever, or Vajrayana Buddhism, like whatever lineage appeals to you. However, if your goal is to become more calm so you can be, more effective at sales, then I would focus on breathing practices. I would focus on bottom up modalities to actually calm down the nervous system, because that's kind of what they're designed for. So that's kind of my sense. It really depends on what someone's goal is. There's also meditations like metta for cultivating loving kindness, which is a beautiful thing to practice, and maybe that increases your sense of empathy and connection to other people, in which case that's great. Um, but yeah, the way that meditation and mindfulness is typically marketed to a lot of people in the West is as this tool to calm down, and I don't think it's especially effective for that. And B, there's just much more effective ways of doing it. And
Correct.
one more thing I'd maybe add to that. You mentioned Vipassana, which is the technique itself is to kind of scan the awareness through the body, different points like over and over again. And that is fantastic for building what's known as interoception, which is this your kind of somatic bodily awareness, which is a really helpful thing to cultivate. And there's a lot of benefits, included things like better decision making. You're more attuned to when you're reacting to something, your intuition's heightened. So for the purpose of cultivating interoceptive awareness, the Vipassana technique can be helpful. But again, I don't think that's why most people would practice it. And one more thing I'll add, like if you're someone who is working very intensely, just the process of taking 10 days off and kind of resetting your dopamine system and not looking at a phone or technology for 10 days, that will be helpful. Like that will be healthy. So
Yeah.
if again, if that's your aim to kind of disconnect and like reset the neural pathways, then also great thing to do.
Very interesting. You mentioned about interoception. Is it about shifting the focus from your mind to the body? Is that
Mm.
what is meant by it?
Yes, so it's not necessary in the beginning, that's often what happens, but over the long run, the idea is that all throughout the day, you are aware of what is happening in your body. You're aware of when you're hungry, you're aware of when you're tired, you're aware of if there's like a tightness in your chest that's maybe related to a frustration that happened in a conversation earlier, or you're basically aware of the enormous amount of feedback that is always coming from our body to our brains, and that is often ignored by many people.
Hmm. Correct. And um, you know, what I've realized over the last year or so is like, uh, how do I look at technology detox? I have, uh, you know, try to reduce my phone usage a lot, but
Mm.
is it the right way to go for a 10-day Vipassana retreat and just stay away from technology, or not to use it over the weekend? What's been the advice you would give to others when it comes to just removing technology from your day-to-day life?
Mm. So, I mean, a Vipassana or 10-day meditation retreat is certainly one way to do it. And I
Right.
think it's actually helpful because you get to see, especially in the first couple of days, like how you respond to not having that constant stimulus and input from other people or social media. So even just as an exercise of self-awareness, it's very helpful. And I think there is some reset of like the dopamine baseline gets reset. So when you come back out, there's a chance to kind of carve new neural pathways afterwards. So that's definitely one approach. And I appreciate it might not be accessible for a lot of people out there. So the other thing that is kind of tying it back to interoception is like noticing how you feel as you're using the phone and specifically when you reach for the phone. Like very often the phone becomes a form of a way of numbing or distracting from something uncomfortable. So let's say if you're procrastinating from doing a thing or you don't want to have a challenging conversation with your spouse, and so instead you reach for Twitter and you just scroll, which I've done. Everyone's done it.
Yeah.
But it's like it's really noticing like what is the reason that I'm reaching for this and am I avoiding something internally versus am I just like genuinely curious to see what my friends are up to on WhatsApp or whatever it is. So it's really about getting clear on like what is your intention in the moment that you reach for the phone, and then also how do you feel as you're using it. Like there's certain times when I might like read a beautiful message from someone and I'll be like, wow, like I'm really glad that I did that. That felt like time well spent versus times when, you just get in like a doom scrolling thing and that's doesn't usually feel good afterwards. It doesn't feel like a good use of that time.
Yeah, and what I've realized is like the couple of apps which I would use, and uh, which would make me endlessly scroll it. Like I used to do that on Instagram. Now I've removed the app. Now I've got YouTube Shorts. So it has replaced my the I get that dopamine effect when I look at YouTube Shorts now.
Mm.
Do you think the right way would be to remove all the apps from the phone, and or maybe look at another phone which would have no apps? Because um I find it really difficult to keep removing apps, but then get addicted to other apps like on Twitter and LinkedIn. It's just such a bad habit. But how do I get away from it?
Yeah, well, again, I think this kind of comes back to like what is the reason for distracting yourself in the beginning?
Right.
And kind of for sure there's a role for setting boundaries, and I think, removing social media apps from phones, things like that is just a general best practice because these tools are inherently addictive. And there's also something in us which is able to be hooked by these things as well. So it's kind of like it's like I guess there's almost like an external approach and an internal approach. The external approach is, as you say, kind of being aware that some of these apps are inherently designed to be addictive, and so being very judicious about which ones you allow on your phone, particularly on your home screen.
Right.
Um, and then also like exploring your relationship to dopamine and your relationship to what are some of the ways often people use phones as a ways to kind of down regulate or to kind of disconnect. And so instead of say, let's say it's like 6 p.m. and you've had a long day, instead of picking up the phone and attempting to down regulate through scrolling YouTube shorts, maybe it's like you replace that kind of transition habit with something like going for a walk or calling a loved one or stretching, breath work. Um, drinking a cup of tea,
Yeah.
like intentionally designing, particularly those transition rituals, I think can be really helpful. And noticing, if your body is overstimulated, which is very easy to do, after a day of work or after a day of sales, then what are the ways in which you can down regulate effectively and healthily? So I love things like non-sleep deep rest, NSDR, um, things like going for a walk, going for a run, playing is great. Um, yeah, so I think if I was to sum it up, it's like intentionality with internal and external.
Got it. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think walking really does help me. And you mentioned about NSDR. What is NSDR? Is it about taking rest?
NSDR stands for non-sleep deep rest.
Okay.
It is a kind of category of different practices derived from yoga nidra.
Okay.
It's essentially between 10 to 45 minutes of guided audio where you lie down, put on an eye mask, and you listen to someone guide you through relaxation exercises, which include actually scanning the body and bringing the awareness to different parts of the body and then breathing into them or relaxing into them.
Okay. Okay.
It's extremely effective and yeah, highly recommend it.
Okay. Okay. And is it about listening to music or brain.fm calm to stimulate yourself to take more rest? Is that what is the intention behind it?
There's certainly relaxing music with some of the audio, but it's more about the the way in which you move your attention around your body, which creates the effect of relaxation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. And when it comes to daily work, there are a lot of emotions that you go through. Sometimes you angry or in a such an in a stressful situation, especially when it comes to tech startups.
Mm,
um and especially what has happened in the last 2 years. There have been a lot of layoffs. There have been there I mean, especially the 2023 was a difficult year.
hmm
Should you look at feeling all your emotions deeply, or should you look at especially when you're in a professional setup, you got to be professional, but how do
mm,
you let out all your emotions so that you
mm.
don't hamper your personal life?
That is a big question.
Yeah.
Again, I'm curious, like what's your sense for that? Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, to be honest, especially when it comes to such stressful situations, the older I get, I think I've been able to manage my emotions more effectively.
Mhm,
I wish I could have said the same thing when I was younger. I I wish I had not been that emotional, but uh, I think the last couple of years I've been able to manage my emotions
mhm,
more effectively, and I think I've calmed down a lot. Maybe that happens when you get older, but something which has happened last year has not happened in the last, yeah, I think 14-15 years, because we didn't have a recession in last 14-15 years. But especially for the younger listeners, who's seeing the recession for the first time, or seeing that sort of a depression for the first time, there would
mhm,
have been a lot of job losses, or they would not have understood how to go through this phase.
mm,
What advice would you give to them on, because there's still a series of layoffs which are happening, and a lot of
mhm,
difficult situations are happening. How do you look at handling that sort of situation, and how should you process such sort of hard emotions?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question.
Yeah,
And yeah, I also just want to like acknowledge that it's a really tough time for a lot of people out there and that
yeah,
it can be super, super challenging. Um, so the way that I think about this, I have this phrase emotional debt, which I think is very helpful. And it has an analogy to technical debt, which many of your listeners might be familiar with. When you're in the early stages of a startup or you're building a tech product, it's often common to accumulate technical debt in the early stages because you're kind of
right,
moving fast and you don't want to build something super thoroughly. So the same is true with our emotions in that if you are, let's say you're like in a boardroom meeting, someone says something which you get really angry and frustrated by, it's very likely not productive for you to then express that anger in the moment because it just doesn't end well. And so being able to kind of have capacity to take on that emotional debt deliberately, almost like kind of repress it basically for the short term is super helpful. And if that happens over and over again, and you don't have a healthy outlet to kind of feel through and express that emotion, it builds up as emotional debt, which then creates fragility in the nervous system. It makes us more susceptible to burnout. It means we'll often, vent on our loved ones. It also doesn't end well. So this is kind of a core part of what I teach is this idea of emotional fluidity and creating really safe situations or places where these emotions can come through. This can be in the context of, for some people, it might be they're working with a somatic therapist, or they're part of a men's group, things like this, where there's explicit permission. If you don't have that, then let's say using anger as an example, maybe it's like going out, like when you're in your car driving on the highway, just like feeling the anger and just like expressing it, like maybe shouting or saying the things that you wish you'd said. Um, Sometimes like at home in your bedroom, like lock the doors, hitting a pillow, just like letting it out and really not only letting it out, but like really feeling the sensations associated. And if you do it, like if you do it in a certain way, there will usually be a sense of like relief on the other side. There'll be like a there's like a sigh and an exhale, and you'll feel lighter basically. Um, and so I think it's really important with really all emotions that they have permission both internally and externally to be expressed. And yeah, that's most workplaces that won't be the case. So it's important to create spaces at home or elsewhere where these emotions can be really kind of felt through so they don't get kinked and basically accumulate that emotional debt, which leads to burnout, which we've obviously been seeing in the culture the last couple of years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think with men, they always taught not to cry, not to show emotions, but you got
Yeah.
to let out those emotions,
Mhm.
because you actually human. And also with men, I think they struggle more than women because they don't share, like women love to communicate or share with their
Mhm.
friends.
Mhm.
And I think this is extremely important going
Mhm.
forward. And you mentioned about the nervous system mastery, boot camp. So how does that work, and how did you go about building this course?
Yeah, so the way that it works, it's a 5 week curriculum, and the three kind of core skills that we teach are we've actually mentioned them all in this called interoception, so building that kind of somatic awareness, self-regulation practices, so breath work for up-regulating or down-regulating the nervous system, so either increasing alertness and aliveness or creating calm, relaxation, down-regulation at the end of the day. And then emotional fluidity, which we've just been talking about, which is how do we almost like often it is relearning and giving ourselves permission to feel these things, which we whether through our school culture or the way we were raised, we just like were taught to kind of push these down. So there's almost like an unlearning that has to happen there. And the course it's also, part of a community. There's usually about 300 people per cohort. So there's kind of a big group of people going through the same journey. We do like an edge challenge where um, you're invited to kind of do something that is uncomfortable that you've maybe been putting off, and then use all of the practices that we learn along the way to kind of help out with that edge challenge. Um, and yeah, it's the course has been so much fun to do. We're going into the fifth cohort this spring.
Nice.
So it's still, it's still developing and learning. We're creating a new format called Nervous System CrossFit, which is basically a kind of like training arena to practice these tools with other people in real time and like obviously improve them. Um, but yeah, I really enjoy it, and the alumni students seem to get a huge amount of value from it. And it's fun.
Nice. Very interesting. And yeah, you're on to your fifth core. What's been the best way to get the word out? Have you used any sort of paid acquisition, or it's been mostly word of mouth for you?
Yeah, it's been mostly so my newsletter, word of mouth, guest podcasts, like
Yeah.
this, like Lenny,
Yeah.
and friends newsletters, and also sponsoring some newsletters as well has been helpful. We're just starting to try some Facebook and Instagram ads.
Okay.
The verdict is, yeah, not yet clear if that's going to be an effective channel, but we'll see.
Okay. Okay. And is it mostly online, or do you also have like offline meetups?
It's mostly online. We do have some meetups for the students in cities where there's a critical mass, and I also do some in-person breath work for people here in Colorado.
Okay. Okay. Got it. Last year has been interesting. I've been following a couple of. I actually got into Twitter and been following people like Dickie Bush,
Mm,
Dango, who wake up really early. I think uh, the most impactful thing I did is I started sleeping on time, and I started waking up really early. But what are the most recommended practices for maintaining and managing stress in your view? What recommendation would you give to people in your morning or evening routine so that you are able to manage your emotions?
mm. Yeah, well, I really would say that it comes back to interoception is really foundational because if you're not aware of how environments or people or things impact your system, you're going to be unable to make changes or run effective experiments. So it's almost like you're like calibrating your kind of never framed it like this before, but you're calibrating your kind of measuring device, which is yourself, and
Right.
then making changes to your environment, to the people that you spend time with, to let's say your morning routine, viewing sunlight in the morning, not looking at screens in the evening, all these things will shift how you feel. But if you're not actually aware of how they impact you, you're not going to make changes. Where it's very motivating if say you are in tune with how you're feeling and you do a breathwork practice and then 5 minutes later you're like, oh, I feel really relaxed. You're going to do that more. It's not going to be something that you have to force yourself to do. You'll just naturally decide to do it because it feels good. Um, but yeah, besides that, I mean, I'm a big fan of contrast therapy, so sauna and ice bath. I do most days myself.
Right.
Um, as Huberman has been saying on the internet, getting sunlight in the morning is very helpful for the circadian rhythm,
Right.
having a consistent sleep-wake time, not looking at any screens, ideally after sunset if possible, and having low lighting. Um, things like that, a kind of a restful sleep environment, darkness at night. I think, there's a whole list of things, and you can just subscribe to Huberman's podcast to get to get a good list of them. But I'd say really focusing on the interoceptive piece and then noticing how trying some of these bottom-up protocols and see how they affect you.
Got it. Interesting. And I quickly want to do the top three. What's your favorite business book?
Yeah, so the one that I just saw on my bookshelf is called The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership by Jim Dethmer. And yeah, just a very good guide for anyone that wants to be a better leader and honestly a better human. Um, it's one of my favorites.
Got it. Got it. We'll put that in our show notes. And i- if you could go back in time when you started working on nervous system mastery, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently?
Yeah, I struggle with this one. I would say probably yeah, I'd say probably learn to ask for help earlier and get more support early on. I spent a lot of time doing everything myself, and it was maybe essential in the beginning, but it was certainly very inefficient. And so I'm learning to kind of ask for both informal and formal help and support so that I can continue growing.
Got it. And do you have any favorite online tools, for example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom?
Yeah, I use a Mac and I love Alfred. It's kind of like I don't even know how to describe it. It's basically I press Command Space and it gives me access to all kinds of shortcuts, snippets. I use it for everything. I say Alfred's been the best tool purchase in recent memory.
Interesting. We'll put that in the show notes. And Johnny, what is the best way people can reach out to you and know more about nervous system mastery?
Yeah, so I'm very active on Twitter/X. My handle is Jonny Miller, JonnyM1LLER. Um, Happy to respond to any questions, curiosities there. And nervous system mastery, if people are interested, is nsmastery.com. Applications should be open now, will be open until March the 15th. And yeah, if this conversation resonated, would love to have you join us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll put that in the show notes. Johnny, thank you so much for taking your time speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
Likewise, yeah, thank you so much. This is super fun.